Well, Christ Community Church, this morning, because it's a special service before Christmas, we tend not to have children's programming at that point. So there's no kids' church today. Okay, there were a couple of you that went off to the races. I was worried about that. So all kids that are with us, I just want you to know we're so glad that you're here. And some of you stay for the service all the way through normally, and others of you, this might just be a unique thing. And look, we're so happy you're here to learn about Jesus with us from the Bible. And if you get a little squirrely today in the pews, we don't care. We're glad you're here. So with that, I want to remind all of us that we are in a series through the month of December that we've been calling Born is the King. That's what we've been calling it. It's been a lot to remember today. Born is the King. As you know, the different Gospels tend to treat and describe Jesus' early years in different ways. And we've been looking at the Gospel of Matthew and his unique portrayal of Jesus' royal birth and his early years. And so this morning, we're going to do the last message in that series, and I would invite you to turn with me in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2. Now, we've had many visitors this morning, and I would imagine many in this worship service, and so perhaps you came this prepared with the Bible, or maybe not. If you don't have a Bible, I want to let you know there is a copy of the Bible in all of the pews there in front of you in those pew racks. And if you'd like to grab one of those, you can find this morning's passage on page 808 of those editions of the Bible, 808. All right, so this is Matthew chapter 2, beginning in verse 13 and reading all the way to the end of the chapter. Follow along as I read God's word. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. "Out of Egypt I called my son." Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping, loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, "Rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel. For those who sought the child's life are dead." And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. And when he had heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. Have you ever noticed that a sort of glossy version of Jesus and his birth abounds at Christmas time? I mean, have you ever just noticed that kind of the pictures on postcards and images around town tend to show us a sort of tame and sterile and picturesque scene of Jesus' birth in our culture? Our paintings and songs and front yard nativity scenes give the impression that everything on that first night was just so glowy and calm when Jesus was born. Like a Thomas Kincaid painting. The sheep look like they've been freshly shampooed, don't they? And there's Mary, who's just given birth to a baby, and yet she had time to put on her perfect makeup and do her hair. And where'd that halo come from, you know? And then there's baby Jesus, no crying he makes. He looks kind of like one of those plastic bitty baby dolls. You seen those in the stores? You know, and he's laid down on that freshly fluffed straw there in a designer manger. It looks like it's been purchased from Crate and Barrel. And everything in these pictures is just perfect and quiet and staged. But here's the problem. Here's the problem with the glossy Jesus and the glossy, perfect manger scene. It might make a great cover for Christmas postcards, but it's hard to relate to. It's hard to relate to. Isn't it true? It's hard to feel a connection with a perfect silent night where everyone has a plastic smile and it's all so tidy. It's hard to relate to it because it looks nothing like our actual messy lives. It doesn't look anything like our lives full of hardship, tragedy, sin, addiction, brokenness, and pain. In fact, for some of you, Christmas is the hardest time of year. Maybe for some of you, when Christmas rolls around, it reminds you of the tragic death of a loved one. Brings all those memories fresh into your mind and heart. For others of you, the holiday season's tough because, you know, extended family comes into town and they bring up those same old arguments, those same old criticisms, those same old conversations around the dinner table. It's difficult. Or maybe for others of you, you don't have very much family to speak of, and Christmas time's actually a season of great loneliness. And still others of you might feel like all the hype and jolliness of Christmas is just a facade behind which you hide with your secret pain and guilt and brokenness. And you're asking, what does the glossy Jesus have anything to do with my messy life? Well, here's the thing. I've got really good news for you. The glossy Jesus is a myth. He doesn't exist. But I'm here to tell you that the real Jesus, the Jesus actually recorded in these scriptures, that Jesus understands you and can relate to you because he's been there in the mess of this broken world in which we live. Jesus Christ, the real Jesus, he entered into our broken world. And Matthew's record of Jesus' earliest years show us that in Jesus' life, he faced, right from the beginning, he faced tyranny and tragedy and bullying and pain and loss. And here's the thing, King Jesus came into our desperate world so that he could save and rescue people like us and bring hope and joy for high-maintenance, needy, messy people like you and me. Here's the point. Here's what I'm saying. The real Jesus is relevant for our real lives, including yours, this Christmas season. And if you want to get the real scoop, if you want to see the real story of Jesus' early years, you want to see the gritty version, the unedited version, we go to the Gospel of Matthew, where Matthew breaks down the story today into 3 separate scenes, and each of these scenes teach us an important lesson about Jesus and how he relates to our real lives. So let's take a look at it. The first scene of this larger story is found in verses 13 through 15. And from that scene, we learn the lesson that Jesus was displaced so that we could be delivered. Jesus was displaced so that we could be delivered. Let me read those verses for us again. Verse 13, now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I have called my son. Now, you will remember if you were here last week, that King Herod was a wicked, cruel, paranoid tyrant and ruler of the Jews. He was only half Jewish, and he was a puppet king for the Romans, and so most of the Jews considered him to be an illegitimate king. He was an egomaniac. He ends up killing several of his family members by the time of the end of his reign. He kills his favorite wife, kills several of his sons. He thought everybody was trying to vie for his throne, whether they were or not. And so in light of all of his narcosis, we aren't surprised that when these wise men come into town, into Jerusalem, and tell Herod, hey, we saw this star and it signaled us to come here and to look for a new king who's just been born. Well, Herod is absolutely threatened. He comes up with a secret plan to eliminate the child. He tells the wise men, I want to worship him too, so why don't you go find him there in Bethlehem where he's predicted to be born? And when you find him, come and tell me and I'll come worship him. And of course, he intended to send his soldiers to kill the newborn child. Well, here's what happens. The wise men do go to Bethlehem. They do find Jesus. They worship him. But then God warns them in a dream, don't go back to Herod. Just go straight home. Herod finds out he's been duped. He's been tricked. They haven't listened to him. He is enraged, as our text tells us here. And so he sends his troops down to Bethlehem to carry out a search and destroy mission. Find this child and kill him. Meanwhile, an angel comes to Joseph in his dreams and tells him he needs to get up and flee with his young family in the middle of the night. Can you imagine what it would be like to be Joseph? Can you just put yourself in his shoes for a moment? He wakes up from this dream. He awakens Mary, and together they rush into Jesus' room. By this time, maybe a year and a half old, something like that. They scoop him up into their arms. They're grabbing all their possessions, anything that they can find, anything that they can carry. And out they go, out in the middle of the night, hoping that no one will notice which direction they went or even that they left. We need to know that travel at night in the ancient world was very dangerous, right? There was a lot of robbers out on the streets at night. Nobody would do this, but they had no choice. They had to get out of town quickly. They abandoned their relationships. Joseph left his livelihood as a carpenter there in Bethlehem. They would have walked away from everything they knew in order to set out on a 75-mile journey to get to that border to Egypt. See, Egypt was often a place where Jews could flee. And there were colonies of Jewish people living in the major Egyptian cities. So Mary and Joseph would have somewhere to go, but here's the thing. They would be strangers living in a foreign land. And here's what I want you to think about. This is so shocking. Think about this. Jesus, the Son of God, was now a refugee. Jesus knows what it's like to be a refugee on the run. Here in Tucson, we have many refugees that come to this country fleeing persecution from other places. And I've had the privilege of meeting several of you. And some of you know what that's like to be a refugee in a foreign land. Wow. Jesus knows what that's like. His family ran for their lives in the middle of the night with a price on their head. Do you ever feel like it's hard to relate to the glossy Jesus? Well, then you need to look at the real Jesus here. He's fleeing for his life and living far from home. He understands what it's like to be on the margins and on the run. His family experienced real fear and uncertainty. They knew what homelessness felt like. Friends, have you ever had a situation in your life where everything in a moment was turned upside down? Jesus' family knew exactly what that feels like. We see it here. But notice something remarkable. God takes this tragedy and turns it into an opportunity to signal us about the hope that Jesus would eventually bring. What do I mean? Well, look again at verse 15. It says, all of this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. What's going on here? Matthew says in that verse, all of this, in other words, this pattern of Jesus going down into Egypt as a refugee in a foreign land, and then eventually coming up out of Egypt, being called out by God as God's son. All of this pattern into Egypt and back out again. This is something that we've seen before in the Old Testament scriptures. And Matthew quotes some words that were originally spoken by God through the ancient prophet Hosea. And let me read you those ancient words from Hosea that are up on the screen. Matthew quotes verse 1, but I'm also going to read you verse 2. In that original context, Hosea 11, verse 1, we read from God, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." And the more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Notice that in Hosea's prophecy here, God is referring to the deliverance of Israel from slavery to Pharaoh in Egypt. This is a reference to the Exodus story. And because of God's great love for them, God had miraculously brought his people out of slavery, delivered them through that Red Sea, and then defeated their enemies on the journey all the way into the promised land. And yet, as the second verse in this quote makes clear, even though God had delivered them, even though they had geographically been freed from Egypt, they were morally still enslaved. They still fell to Egypt's idols and to sin and to rebellion against God. In fact, the story of Israel is the story of constant failure. Even though God rescued them, they constantly wander from him. It's like they needed a greater Moses and a greater deliverance and a greater Exodus to really set them free. Well, back to Matthew, because here Matthew is signaling us with this little quote. Matthew is signaling us here to say that the greater Moses has come. It's the refugee Jesus. He's God's son par excellence. Jesus is the one who can free us, not just from Pharaoh, not just from Egypt, not just from physical slavery, but Jesus can free us from the spiritual bondage of sin and Satan and judgment and death. The refugee child Jesus would grow to become a man who would live a perfect, sinless life like all of us should have lived. And then he would die on a Roman cross in order to purchase the freedom of sinners. And now, any who would put their trust in him can find true deliverance from sin, true freedom to live in relationship with God both now and for all eternity. Jesus is the greater Moses. Jesus is the one who leads us in the true Exodus. Jesus is the one who provides us with ultimate freedom from the bondage that we face. Jesus was displaced so that we could be delivered. That's the message. He's the deliverer. I wonder, for you, who or what do you look to for deliverance in your life? What do you look to for deliverance? You know, people all over our world and in our culture look to various things for deliverance, for ultimate deliverance for their soul. Some people look to wealth and material possessions, and they think if I just have enough stuff, I'll finally be free. Here's the problem. The more stuff that we get, the more impoverished that we really feel, don't we? Other people are looking for pleasure and experiences for deliverance, for euphoria, right? They think they'll find freedom there. But here's the problem. Again, our addictions make us lonelier and more bound than ever before. Other people look to politics for deliverance. Others look to education or self-improvement for deliverance. Others look to relationships or maybe technology for rescue, for a sense of deliverance from our fears and our inadequacies and our shame and our hurt and our brokenness. But here's the thing, none of these can really deliver us like Jesus can. Only Jesus can claim to be the powerful Son of God as he's described in this text. And only Jesus was willing to go so low as to be displaced as a refugee and ultimately as an outcast all the way to the cross so that now he could deliver the likes of us. Only Jesus has the power to save and the willingness to go low enough to save the likes of us. Jesus was displaced so that we could be delivered. There's just no deliverer quite like him, brothers and sisters. So if you're running to anything else for ultimate deliverance in your life, I want you to know that you should turn and run to Jesus. Out of Egypt, God called his son, and Jesus will deliver us out of Egypt too. if we're only willing to trust him and follow him. That's what Matthew wants us to see here, I think, in this first scene. But notice the second scene. The second scene in verses 16 through 18. And here we see that Jesus was exiled so that we could be restored. Jesus was exiled so that we could be restored. Verses 16 through 18, let me read it again. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in that region where they were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they are no more. I'm sorry, that little baby cried right at that moment when we were reading this tragic scene, and I was just overcome by it. Because this scene, more than any other, it really shows us, doesn't it, that Jesus was born into a world of tyranny and genocide and death and pain. But listen, there's good news in this. Because the gospel is not good news that Jesus sends his thoughts and prayers from afar. That's not the gospel. The gospel is the good news that Jesus comes and enters right into the middle of this tragic and broken world in order to fix it from the inside out. Herod was trying to make absolutely sure that he killed all the newborn children of Bethlehem, and he was trying to make sure he killed this newborn king. And based upon the fact that the wise men had told him when they saw the star rise, judging that to be the time when the newborn king was born, he then did some math. He did some calculations. And apparently he figured that this child could be as old as 2 years old. And so he sends his men in to kill all the little boys of 2 years and under. Now, based on the estimate that Bethlehem was something like 1,000 people by this time, this means that there could have been 20 babies or so murdered that night. We can only imagine the horror in that little town. And it reminds us again of the story of the Exodus where Pharaoh, remember, he orders the death of every Hebrew child and says, throw them in the Nile. It reminds us also of Satan himself, who is described in Revelation chapter 12 as a dragon ready to devour the newborn king. Look, this picture is a picture of what sin and evil and destruction look like. This is where unfettered sin leads. It leads to genocide, my friends. And if you're reading this and you recoil at this story and its brutality, please realize that God recoils even more. God hates the brokenness of his creation even more than we do. God grieves over the destruction of sin and death far more than you and I ever do. But listen, though baby Jesus escapes this slaughter, we need to realize that the whole tragedy foreshadows the fact that Jesus too will one day be killed, murdered on that cross by evil men. And yet in that, in the death of Jesus, there is hope. See, Jesus' eventual death would be God's solution to the problem of death forever. Jesus' death would one day bring hope that death and tyranny and genocide would be eliminated once and for all. In fact, I want you to see, it's counterintuitive here, but Matthew gives us a very clever signal of hope in this little paragraph. You say, what do I mean? Where's this signal of hope? Well, look again at verse 17. He says, then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. Let me explain this closely. Look carefully with me. It's a quote from the book of Jeremiah. In particular, it's from Jeremiah 31, verse 15. Now, in that text, Jeremiah the prophet is describing the horrors of the exile. You'll remember that the southern region of Israel, the land of Judah, was eventually taken over by the Babylonians. In 586 BC, they came in and they destroyed the city of Jerusalem, and they took as captives hundreds of the Israelites. And so Jeremiah, in this verse, references a sort of scene where all of these Israelite captives are being led out of Jerusalem, past the ancient city of Ramah, being led out in chains to their exile. And Jeremiah poetically portrays Rachel, who is one of the matriarchs of Israel, Rachel crying out from her grave in lament as she watches her children being marched off to Babylon. Interestingly enough, Rachel was buried near Bethlehem. And so Matthew says in our text this morning that it's as though Rachel were weeping from her grave once again, but this time she's weeping for the death of all these little children. And it's as though Jesus is being associated with those exiles. Just as the young family was taken out of town, exiled in that sense, out to Egypt, even so, Jesus is equated with the exiles of old. But here's the message of hope. You say, why did you say there was hope here? Here's why. If we go back to Jeremiah chapter 31, here's what we see. Immediately after that text where Rachel weeps, Jeremiah predicts a coming day where there will be joy again. The exiles will return. Let me show you. Immediately after Matthew's quote, we read of restoration. Jeremiah 31, verse 16, the next verse after the weeping verse. Here's what it says. Thus says the Lord, keep your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for there is a reward for your work, declares the Lord, and they shall come back from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your future, declares the Lord. Your children shall come back to their own country. And then further on, Jeremiah 31, this is a text you'll recognize. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand and brought them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them. I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God. They shall be my people. No longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, know the Lord. For they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity. I will remember their sins no more. See, Jeremiah 31 predicts that though there was great agony and weeping and sorrow and lament in the exile, God would one day bring his people back home. They would be restored. And this time, God would make a new covenant and write his law on their hearts and be their God and forgive them permanently and remember their shame no more. Okay, with all of that as background, now we're back to Matthew. Matthew quotes the Rachel weeping text as a hint that we need to remember the whole chapter of Jeremiah 31. That this pain and sorrow in Bethlehem that night will one day result in the greatest imaginable hope. The little child Jesus was being associated with the exile because he is the one who would one day restore God's people and usher in this new covenant and put God's law on their hearts and forgive them permanently through the cross. See, the quote is a sign of hope. And this is what Matthew wants us to see. There is no other hope in the face of tyranny and death and genocide and tragedy than Jesus. Only Jesus has the power to restore a world that is this broken. Only Jesus. Maybe this morning you're bothered by the level of violence in this story. You wonder, why does God allow this kind of thing ever to go on? It's a good question to ask. It's a question about the problem of evil and pain and suffering in this world. Do you realize, my friend, that every single worldview has to grapple with the problem of evil in the world? Whether you're an atheist or an agnostic or a very religious person of various stripes, you still have to grapple with the problem of suffering and evil. You have to grapple with the problem that little babies can be murdered by tyrants. Everybody has to grapple with the problem of evil. But here's what makes Christianity unique. I want you to see this. Only in Christianity does God come and solve the problem of suffering and evil and death by entering into our evil world and suffering unto death. This is the good news of the gospel, and it's so unique. Jesus defeats sin and evil by taking it to himself on the cross. Jesus defeats death by dying and rising again. Jesus was exiled on that cross so that you and I could be restored and evil could be vanquished once and for all. So we might not fully understand why God would allow a world with the possibility of suffering and genocide where babies can die. But this much we do know. God cares, and God came to fix it. He cares so much that he would suffer in this broken world in the person of his Son so that suffering might one day be a distant memory. Jesus was exiled so that we could be restored. And so one day he could make a beautiful new world. That's a message of hope that Matthew wants us to see right in the midst of this tragedy. But there's one final scene, which we see here in verses 19 through 23, one final lesson. In these verses, in this final scene, we see that Jesus was also despised so that we could be accepted. Jesus was despised so that we could be accepted. Verses 19 through 23. Look there, I'll read them again. But when Herod had died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. Here's the deal. Just like God told Moses in the book of Exodus, okay, everybody who was seeking your life is dead now. You can go home. In the same way, the angel comes back to Joseph and tells him, everyone seeking Jesus' life are gone. You can go home now, right? We see that comparison. Jesus is like a greater Moses. The story is being lived out afresh. And I just want to point out to you that Jesus outlasts Herod. Herod's dead, Jesus is not in this text. In fact, Jesus outlasts every rival king that we face. Do you realize that? I mean, one day in eternity future in heaven, like a gajillion years from now, we're going to look up and realize and look back. We'll realize that every tyrant and every bully and every evil power and every sinful stronghold of this world is just a distant memory. But Jesus is still alive and well, as he's the King of Kings, reigning over all things. He outlasts them all. So here's the thing. I don't know what evil struggle or manipulative power that you might face this morning, brothers and sisters. But hear this. Jesus will outlast every rival king. So stay in the fight and hold on to Christ. Notice in the story here in this final section that God is working through the gritty historical details. And Joseph takes the family home only to find that Herod's son, Archelaus, was now reigning over the region of Judea, that is Jerusalem and where Bethlehem would be. And so Joseph is afraid to go there because Archelaus was evil like his father. He was a wicked tyrant. And then God confirms his fears with another dream and directs Joseph to go up north to the region of Galilee and to take the family to the obscure little mountain village of Nazareth. Now, why does that matter? Why make such a point of that detail, that Jesus went to Nazareth, that he was called a Nazarene? Verse 23 says that he went and lived in a city called Nazareth so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. See, here's the thing. Nazareth is nowhere mentioned in the Old Testament. So how is it that Matthew says that this fulfilled prophecy that Jesus would be called a Nazarene? Well, here's the deal. To be called a Nazarene was a cut down. We need to understand that calling someone a Nazarene was like calling them a hick, or calling them a hillbilly, or calling them a redneck or a backwoodsman. It's like saying, oh, you're one of those people from Nowheresville. Remember that scene in the Gospel of John where Philip comes running back to tell his brother Nathanael, we found the Messiah, we found the Messiah. It's Jesus of Nazareth. And Nathanael's like, Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? It's a cut down, it's slang. It's prejudice mudslinging. You thumb your nose at someone by calling them a Nazarene. So, where did the Old Testament prophets predict that the Messiah would be called names? That he would be belittled verbally like this? Well, it's a running theme in the Old Testament, several places we could go, but the Messiah would come from obscurity and he would be ridiculed. Let me give you some quick examples. Psalm 22, verse 6 through 7. This is the Messiah speaking here. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. Or take this prophecy from Isaiah 11, verse 1. It says, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. Okay, so the image here is of the line of King David, the line of Jesse, this kingly line, which is like a huge tree, but the tree gets chopped down, and all that's left is a stump, this huge stump. But out of this huge, mighty stump comes this little tiny shoot. That's the Messiah. He'll grow up in obscurity. Or take a look at this prophecy from Isaiah 53, 1 through 3. Who has believed what he has heard from us? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he, that is the Messiah, grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. It's a theme of humility. It's a theme of obscurity. It's a theme of rejection. And Matthew points out that Jesus did not grow up in Jerusalem in a palace fit for a king. No, Jesus grew up in a village so small and so obscure that people mocked you if you're from there. Ever been called names? They hurt, don't they? Jesus, the Son of God, glorious, eternal, all-powerful, almighty Son of God, knows what it feels like to be called names, to have your hometown made fun of. So why? Why did Jesus need to become so ordinary, like Matthew points out here? Why did the Son of God, the everlasting King of Kings, not just become a human, but become an ordinary nobody like me and you, and then be rejected and even made fun of? Why? Here's why. Because in stooping this low to our level, Jesus was able to bring us up. He was despised so we could be accepted, affirmed, and blessed. He became like us in every sense so that we could one day become like him in glory. Here's how the author of Hebrews puts it in its own way. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10. It was fitting that God, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation, that's Jesus, perfect through suffering. Since therefore the children, that's people like you and me, since the children share in flesh and blood, Jesus himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has power of death, Therefore, Jesus had to be made like his brothers in every respect so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Here's the point. Jesus becomes an ordinary, obscure, everyday person like you and me. He becomes one of those deplorables from Galilee. All so that he could then come to our rescue in lowliness and bring us back up to glory. You know, politicians are always telling us about their background. They'll say stuff like, oh, my father worked in the steel mills, and my grandmother was an immigrant, and my family was poor, and this and that way, okay? And why do they do that? Because they're trying to relate to the everyday voter. Trying to relate. Here's the difference between those politicians and Jesus. Jesus is not embellishing to get your vote. Jesus really is the King of Kings who really did become a refugee and then really did come back to settle down in a town that was so small that people made fun of you if you were from there. So this morning, if you're poor, this morning, if you're humble, this morning, if you're lowly or misunderstood or overlooked, I want you to know Jesus gets it. He gets you because he became one of you. He became one of us. And his lowly credentials make him perfectly qualified to make people like us acceptable once again in God's sight. Well, putting this all together then, all these three scenes and this larger story from Matthew, I just want to encourage you this morning. I want to encourage you this Christmas season, with just a couple days to go before Christmas is here. I especially want to encourage you if sometimes for you Christmas seems a bit trite and fabricated and commercialized. If you're a bit tired of the plastic glowy version of Jesus, then this morning I want to encourage you with the real Jesus. The humble refugee who came into this weary world full of sin and tragedy and scorn. That Jesus, the real Jesus, he understands your sorrow. He knows your pain. And he came to fix this broken world by entering right into the middle of it, giving us hope. So this Christmas, why not let him carry you? Why not let him encourage you with his joy? Why not let him fill you with his hope? Why not let him empower you with his life? See, he's the son of David. He's the son of Joseph. He's the king of the Jews. He's the king of the world. He's the son of God, and he's our empathetic Savior King who understands our every pain. And he is worthy, my friends, of our worship. And then let me dismiss us with this benediction from Numbers chapter 6. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Merry Christmas, brothers and sisters.